In Victorian London, a woman walking alone after 11 o'clock at night was not simply unusual. She was, by legal interpretation, a prostitute, not by her occupation, not by anything she had done, by the simple fact of being present on a public street after that hour without a man beside her. There was no sign posted anywhere that said so. No clock struck a warning. The rule lived instead in the eyes of a constable on a corner, in the discretion of a magistrate half asleep on his bench, in the raised eyebrow of a landlady counting the minutes until curfew. It lived in statute books too, quietly, in language broad enough to hold almost any woman the state wished to catch. She does not know this yet, the woman walking home tonight. She only knows that her feet ache, that the parcel under her arm has gone heavy with the weight of a long day, and that the last omnibus left 20 minutes ago without her. The street she walks is narrow, cobbled and mostly dark. Gaslight falls in small, deliberate pools every 100 yards or so, and between them the shadow is complete. She keeps to the lit patches when she can. It is a habit she has never examined. It simply feels safer to be seen. Somewhere behind her, footsteps. She does not turn. Turning would mean acknowledging that she has heard them, and acknowledging them would mean deciding what to do about it, and there is nothing to be done about it that would not also be watched, judged, and quietly filed away by whoever happens to be standing in the next doorway. This is the world you are about to enter. Not a world of dragons or invading armies, not a world announced by trumpets. A world governed instead by a curfew nobody voted on, enforced by men who answered to no one but their own suspicion, against women whose only crime, most nights, was being outside when the wrong sort of eyes happened to be looking. Somewhere ahead of her, past the next pool of gaslight and the one after that, her own street waits and her own door, and the particular relief of a lock turning easily under a key that is hers alone. She does not know, tonight, the name of the law that shapes so much of how she moves through the dark. She only knows the shape of the fear it has left behind, worn smooth by habit, carried without complaint, the way so many women of her century carried so much. You are in England, somewhere between the 1860s and the 1880s, in one of the port towns or garrison towns or the great sprawling capital itself. The exact year does not matter yet. What matters is the hour, and what the hour has come to mean. By day, the streets belong to everyone. Costermongers shout the price of oysters and violets. Omnibuses rattle past, packed tight with clerks and governesses and tired shopgirls. A woman can walk from the draper's to the chemist's to her own front door, and nobody thinks twice about it, because daylight is a kind of proof. It shows what you are doing, who you are with, where you are going. Daylight vouches for you. Night withdraws that proof. And in its place, in certain towns, under certain laws passed with almost no public debate at all, the state had quietly decided that the absence of proof was itself a kind of guilt. This did not happen everywhere in England, and it did not happen to every woman. That is part of what makes it worth sitting with tonight. The danger was not evenly spread. It pooled in specific towns, on specific streets, around specific army barracks and naval yards, and it fell hardest on women who had the least power to resist it. But its shadow reached further than its letter. Ordinary women in ordinary towns absorbed its lesson without ever reading a page of it, that a woman alone, after dark, was a woman who had already made herself suspect. You will meet, over the next hour or so, a law that most people alive today have never heard named. You will meet the women it was built to police, examined, and detained. You will meet the men who wrote it, argued for it, and quietly hoped no one outside the newspaper's back pages would ever notice it. And you will meet the women, some of them mothers, some of them grandmothers by the time it was finally undone, who spent 20 years making sure that everyone did notice. You will also, before this story is finished, meet the ordinary texture of an entire century's night streets, the gaslight and the long shadows it left uncovered between one lamp and the next, the etiquette manuals quietly instructing young women never to walk a city street alone, the particular ache of a working woman's feet at the end of a 12-hour shift, and the particular fear that could settle over her regardless, the moment a church clock struck a certain hour and she still had streets left to cross before reaching her own door. There is a particular kind of history that never gets carved into a monument. No statue stands in a town square for the seamstress stopped on her way home from a 12-hour shift, made to give her name to a constable who had never seen her before in his life. No plaque marks the boarding house where a frightened 17-year-old spent her last night of freedom before a medical inspection she had no power to refuse. This is that kind of history. quiet, undramatic to look at, and enormous underneath. It is also, importantly, a story with an ending worth staying awake a little longer to hear, even in a tale meant to carry you towards sleep rather than away from it. Unlike so many chapters of history where cruelty simply continues unexamined and unresisted generation after generation, this particular cruelty met real, sustained, ultimately successful opposition, built and carried for 2 decades by women who had almost every reason to expect failure and kept working anyway. That too is part of what makes this story worth telling slowly and worth letting settle properly before the night finally takes you. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this every week and it helps more than you would think. This particular story begins, as so many quiet injustices do, with a problem the government considered urgent and a solution the government preferred not to discuss too loudly. The problem was disease, spreading through barracks and ships. The solution, arrived at in the 1860s, would end up defining what it meant to be a respectable woman out after dark for the next 20 years, and the echo of it would outlast the law itself by generations. We do have a small library of stories like this one, narrated in full, over on Spotify now too, if your eyes need a rest tonight instead of your ears carrying you through a screen. The link sits in the description and in the pinned comment whenever you want it. For now, settle in. Let the room around you go soft and unimportant. What you're about to hear happened to real women, in real streets, and it happened because of 11 simple words, tucked into an Act of Parliament, that almost nobody outside a courtroom ever read aloud. Before there was a law, there was a habit. Long before any Act of Parliament touched the question, English towns had already decided in the quiet, unspoken way that customs decide things, that a respectable woman did not walk alone once night had properly settled in. The habit did not need enforcing by police at first. It enforced itself through the much older mechanism of what the neighbours would say. A young unmarried woman was expected, by the etiquette books that circulated through middle-class parlours, never to go about the streets of a city or large town unaccompanied. A maid would do if a mother or an older relation could not. The chaperone existed for exactly this purpose, to convert an unaccompanied woman, dangerous and unreadable, into an accompanied one, safe and legible. The rule was strictest in the cities where, as the etiquette writers put it, people were of many classes and unknown to one another. In a village, everyone could vouch for you by knowing your face. In a city, your face meant nothing. You needed a companion to vouch for you instead. This was the soft version of the rule, the one enforced by gossip rather than statute. It applied more or less to every class of woman, though its consequences were never evenly weighted. A gentleman's daughter caught walking alone after dark risked a whisper, a slightly cooler reception at the next dinner party, perhaps a harder time finding a husband. A working woman caught in the same circumstance risked something else entirely, and it is that second, harder version of the rule that this story is really about. To understand why night mattered so much, you have to understand what night actually was in a world before electric light. Picture the ordinary streets of an English town in the 1860s once the sun has gone down and the shops have shuttered. There is no comforting orange wash of streetlights stretching unbroken from corner to corner. There is gaslight, and gaslight is a different animal altogether. The gas lamps of Victorian England were lit by hand every evening by a municipal lamplighter who walked his route with an 8-foot brass pole balanced against his shoulder, a small flame dancing at its tip. He would touch the flame to each lamp in turn, and the street would bloom briefly into a small circle of amber light before falling back into shadow until the next lamp 100 paces on. Between those circles, the darkness was close to total, especially on a moonless night or one wrapped in the coal smoke fog that settled over English cities with grim regularity. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. A street a modern eye would call merely dim was, to Victorian eyes and Victorian imaginations, close to lawless. Anyone who ventured beyond the reach of a lamp's small gold circle was, for those few seconds, invisible. Robbery, assault, and worse, all found easy cover in that invisibility, and the newspapers of the period were never short of stories to prove it. A woman walking that street alone was walking through a chain of small, bright, safe harbours separated by pools of genuine risk, and everybody who used those streets after dark knew it in their bones, whether or not they could have explained the mechanics of gas combustion. So the fear that shaped the soft rule, the chaperonage rule, was not entirely invented. Night genuinely was more dangerous, in the plainest physical sense, than day. But something curious happened to that fear as it moved through Victorian society. It did not stay pointed only at the men who might do the robbing or the assaulting. Slowly, and then not so slowly, it turned to face the women instead. A woman who was harmed while walking alone at night had, in the eyes of a great many respectable people, invited a portion of that harm simply by being there. This was rarely stated so baldly. It was implied in the raised eyebrow, in the magistrate's tone, in the newspaper column that described a victim's evening habits in more detail than the crime committed against her. The question asked of a woman found in trouble after dark was so often not what happened to you, but what were you doing out? It is a short step, and history took it quickly, from suspecting a woman's judgment to suspecting her character. And it is an even shorter step from suspecting her character to suspecting her profession. By the middle of the century, in the minds of a great many respectable Englishmen and not a few respectable English women, there existed a kind of unspoken taxonomy. A woman on a well-lit main street before 10 o'clock in the company of a husband or brother or father was simply a woman. A woman on a side street, alone, after 11, in worn boots and a shawl instead of a good coat, was something else, something closer, in the eyes that watched her, to a category than a person. This taxonomy was never written into any single sentence you could point to and call the rule. It lived instead in the accumulation of small habits, small policies, small decisions made by small men with a little brief authority over a street corner, a constable deciding whom to stop, a landlord deciding whom to let a room to, a shopkeeper deciding whom to serve after dusk without a second glance, and whom to watch carefully until she had left the premises. And then, in the summer of 1864, that unspoken taxonomy found itself something it had never had before, a legal definition, a category with the force of Parliament behind it, and police empowered to enforce it in 11 towns scattered along England's southern coast and around its major naval and military stations. It would not stay confined to 11 towns for long, and it would not stay confined, in its effects, to the women it was technically written to describe. It would teach an entire generation of English women, respectable and otherwise, exactly what could happen to a woman the state decided did not belong on a street after a certain hour. It would teach them to walk faster, to keep to the light, to never, under any circumstance, be caught explaining themselves to a man with the power to write down what he believed about them and make it true. Long before the Contagious Diseases Acts existed, English law already had a name for the kind of woman it wished to move off the street after dark. The Vagrancy Act of 1824, still very much in force throughout this period, punished what it called an idle and disorderly person, a phrase that folded together beggars, unlicensed peddlers, and, in its own careful legal language, every common prostitute wandering in any public street or highway, or in any place of public resort, and behaving in a riotous or indecent manner. Notice how much work that single clause was already doing, decades before the acts this story concerns itself with. A woman did not need to be found doing anything in particular. Wandering itself in the wrong place was already most of the offence. What counted as riotous or indecent behaviour was, of course, left almost entirely to the judgment of the constable on duty, which meant it was left in practice to whatever a given constable happened to believe about a given woman's dress, tone of voice, or simple presence on his patch that night. A loud laugh in the wrong doorway, a conversation with a man in uniform that lasted a beat too long, standing still near a lamp-post for reasons that seemed to a passing officer insufficiently purposeful. The law did not require proof of solicitation. It required only that a constable be prepared to swear, if pressed, that he believed what he believed. This is worth holding on to as the deeper legal soil out of which the Contagious Diseases Acts would eventually grow. England did not invent, from nothing, in 1864, the idea that a woman's presence on a night street could itself constitute a kind of evidence against her. That idea had already been sitting quietly in the statute books for 40 years, tested in police courts up and down the country, refined by decades of magistrates' rulings into a set of loose, informal habits that every experienced constable carried in his head without needing to consult a single page of it. The etiquette manuals of the period, meanwhile, were doing their own complementary work from the opposite direction, not through punishment but through instruction. One widely read guide to conduct instructed that young girls should never go about the streets of a city or large town unaccompanied by an older person or a maid, and noted that the need for a chaperone was especially pressing in communities where there were large populations and people were necessarily of many classes and unknown to one another. In a village, the reasoning went, everybody's face served as its own reference. In a city, a woman's face proved nothing at all, and something else, a companion, a maid, a male relative, had to be produced to vouch for her instead. It is worth noticing how neatly the etiquette manual's soft warning and the Vagrancy Act's hard penalty pointed in exactly the same direction, from entirely different starting places. One appealed to a mother's fear of scandal, the other carried the threat of arrest. Between them, they built a kind of pincer around any woman who might otherwise have simply walked home alone after a long day, a pincer that required no coordination at all between the clergyman writing the etiquette guide and the magistrate signing the arrest warrant, because both men had already absorbed from the same surrounding culture the same underlying assumption about what an unaccompanied woman after dark was likely to be. Consider, too, how much the ordinary texture of an English night reinforced all of this at the most basic physical level, quite apart from any law or any etiquette book. Gaslighting had spread rapidly through English towns over the first half of the century, and by the 1860s, hundreds of miles of gas main ran beneath the streets of London alone, feeding thousands of individual lamps. This was, by any fair comparison, remarkable progress, the envy of cities across the developing world that still relied on the older, dimmer technology of oil lamps or went without street lighting altogether, and yet even at its most extensive, gaslight covered only the streets a town council considered worth the expense. Main thoroughfares, shopping streets, the approaches to significant public buildings, these received generous lighting. The narrow lanes behind them, the courts and alleys where poorer residents actually lived, often received little or none at all. A woman's actual physical safety then depended enormously on which side of that lighting boundary her ordinary daily life happened to fall. A shopkeeper's wife living above a well-lit high street moved through a very different night than a laundress living 2 streets back, down an unlit court that the borough surveyor had simply never got around to wiring. Both women absorbed the same cultural lesson about the danger and impropriety of walking alone after dark. Only one of them had gaslight to walk through while she did it. The lamplighter himself became, in many towns, an oddly reassuring figure to the women who timed their evening errands around his rounds. He kept a fixed schedule, dusk to dusk, walking the same route at roughly the same hour every evening of the year, adjusting only for the slow creep of the seasons. A woman who knew her town well enough could time her walk home to arrive just behind him, following the trail of freshly lit lamps rather than walking ahead of it into streets still dark. This was never written down as advice anywhere. It was simply the kind of quiet, practical knowledge that passed between women, mother to daughter, mistress to servant, one working woman to the next, the way genuinely useful survival knowledge tends to pass, informally and without ceremony, long before anyone thinks to record it. It is worth remembering, too, that the fear surrounding night itself was not new to the Victorians, even if the particular legal machinery this story concerns itself with was. English folklore had, for centuries before gaslight ever existed, populated the darkness with its own hazards, real and imagined alike, from footpads and highwaymen to the simple, older dread of a road you could not see the end of. What the 1860s added to that ancient unease was something more specific and more bureaucratic. The possibility that the greatest danger waiting in the dark might not be a stranger at all, but a uniformed representative of the Crown, acting entirely within the law, whose interest in you carried none of the folk tales' clarity about who the villain was supposed to be. Court records from the period, thin and formal as they are, occasionally let a flicker of this ordinary texture through. Police court proceedings, reported in brief in local newspapers, sometimes noted the hour and location at which a woman had been apprehended with the same flat specificity used to record any other detail of an arrest. 11:15, near the Commercial Road. 10:30 outside the dockyard gate. These small, precise timestamps, meant only as administrative fact, now read almost like a map of exactly when and where an ordinary evening could, without warning, tip over into something far more consequential. That law is where this story properly begins. Not with a monster, and not with a villain twirling anything as theatrical as a moustache, but with a committee, a naval health report, and a solution that seemed, to the men who devised it, entirely reasonable. The problem, from the government's point of view, had nothing at all to do with women walking home after their shifts ended. It had to do with soldiers and sailors, and with a number that alarmed the War Office more than almost anything short of open mutiny. By the early 1860s, roughly a third of the British Army was, at any given time, dealing with the effects of venereal disease, in a force that depended on healthy men to fight wars across an empire that stretched around the entire globe. That number looked less like a private medical matter and more like a threat to national capability. The army did not permit its enlisted men to marry in any great number. Officers might marry. Ordinary soldiers, for the most part, could not without special and limited permission. This left a very large population of young men stationed far from home in garrison towns and port towns built up specifically to service naval and military life, with very few socially sanctioned outlets and a great many unsanctioned ones close at hand. A committee was formed to consider the problem in 1862. It looked, as committees of that era tended to look, almost entirely at one half of the equation. Soldiers were falling ill. Soldiers therefore needed protecting, and the protection the committee eventually recommended did not involve soldiers at all. It involved policing the women who worked, or were suspected of working, near the barracks and the docks. The result was the Contagious Diseases Prevention Act of 1864, passed by Parliament that summer with remarkably little fuss. It received royal assent on the 29th of July. Very few newspapers covered it in any depth, and fewer members of the public outside the towns it directly affected had any idea it existed at all. Part of this was deliberate. Prostitution was not considered a fit subject for open discussion in respectable print, and a bill that dealt so explicitly with it moved through Parliament partly protected by the very taboo it was built around. It is a strange kind of historical irony that a law reshaping the lives of thousands of women managed to pass almost silently, because the polite convention of the age forbade anyone from speaking plainly about what it actually did. What it actually did was this. In 11 specified port and garrison towns across the south of England and Ireland, the Act empowered police to identify women they believed to be common prostitutes and to bring them before a magistrate. If a magistrate agreed there were reasonable grounds for suspicion, the woman could be ordered to submit to a compulsory internal medical examination in search of venereal disease. Refuse the examination, and a woman could face imprisonment, submit and be found infected, and she could be confined for a period of months in a specially designated hospital until doctors judged her cured. Notice, before we go any further, the shape of what was missing from this arrangement. The soldiers and sailors who made up the other half of every transaction the Act was meant to interrupt faced no equivalent inspection. No medical board waited outside the barracks gate to examine the men before or after their evenings in town. The entire mechanism of suspicion, arrest, examination, and confinement pointed in one direction only. A disease that by definition required two people to transmit was treated, by the law of the land, as though it belonged to only one of them. This was not an oversight. It reflected, quite precisely, how many educated Victorian men genuinely understood the world to work. Male sexual appetite was widely regarded as a natural force, difficult to restrain, and not especially blameworthy for existing. Female sexuality, by contrast, particularly female sexuality expressed outside marriage, was treated as a moral failure, a kind of contamination in itself, quite apart from any disease that happened to travel alongside it. A woman who sold sex was understood not merely to be breaking a rule, but to be, in some more fundamental sense, a different category of person than a respectable woman. And different categories of person, in the logic of the age, could reasonably be subjected to different categories of law. The 11 towns chosen for the first act were not chosen at random. They clustered around the places where Britain's military and naval power physically lived, Portsmouth and Plymouth, the great naval strongholds. Woolwich with its arsenal, Chatham, the historic dockyard on the Medway, places like Colchester and Aldershot built up almost entirely around the presence of garrisoned troops. In these towns, unlike almost anywhere else in England, an ordinary woman going about an ordinary evening had just acquired, without her knowledge or her vote, a set of streets and hours in which her mere presence could summon the machinery of the state. It is worth remembering, too, that not a single woman had any say whatsoever in the passage of this law in the most direct and literal sense imaginable. English women in 1864 could not vote for the members of Parliament who wrote, debated, and passed the Contagious Diseases Acts. They could not stand for election themselves. They could not sit on the committee that first recommended the legislation, nor on the parliamentary benches where it was finally approved. Every meaningful decision shaping what could be done to a woman's body under this law was made entirely by men, discussing women in rooms women were not permitted to enter. This is easy to state as a bare historical fact and considerably harder to sit with as a lived reality, but it belongs at the very centre of this story rather than at its edges. The acts were not simply unjust in their content. They were unjust in their very authorship, a law built almost exclusively around female bodies, without a single woman present in the room where it was written. It helps, too, to understand what had come immediately before the committee's recommendation, because the Contagious Diseases Acts were not conjured from nothing. British military officials had been watching, with real professional interest, a rather different approach already in use across parts of continental Europe, particularly in France, where certain cities operated systems of state-regulated prostitution, complete with police registration and mandatory medical inspection of registered women. English reformers of a more moralistic bent had long criticised the French system as a form of state-endorsed vice. And yet, when the War Office went looking for a practical solution to its own disease numbers, it borrowed the French model's basic machinery almost wholesale, even as English public opinion continued to regard the French approach, in the abstract, with polite official disapproval. Britain, in other words, imported a system it claimed to find distasteful, dressed it in the language of public health rather than state regulation, and applied it quietly, without ever quite admitting the resemblance out loud. The committee itself, meeting through 1862 and into the following year, took evidence almost exclusively from military doctors, naval surgeons, and police officials already inclined to support some version of compulsory examination. Very few witnesses were called who might have raised the civil liberties of the women who would eventually be examined, and none of the women themselves were consulted in any capacity at all. This was standard practice for the age. Committees investigating matters that touched deeply on women's bodies rarely thought to include women's own testimony among the evidence worth gathering, a pattern that would recur with grim consistency throughout this entire story. In 1866, the government returned to the subject and passed a second act, considerably sharper than the first. Where the original law had rested its case for examination on individual suspicion brought before a magistrate, the new act allowed known or previously registered prostitutes to be required to submit to examination, as a matter of course, at regular intervals, without the same case having to be made afresh each time. It also extended police powers and widened the geography slightly. In 1869, a third act extended the geography further still and lengthened the periods for which infected women could be detained. A support organisation sprang up almost immediately to champion this expansion. The Association for Promoting the Extension of the Contagious Diseases Acts, founded in 1867, campaigned openly for the entire system to be extended beyond the original garrison and port towns, applied instead to the whole of the United Kingdom's civilian population. Its members were not shadowy or marginal figures. They included respected physicians, clergymen, and members of Parliament, all convinced, in perfectly good conscience by their own lights, that regular medical policing of women suspected of prostitution represented sound public health practice rather than a violation of anything worth protecting. The existence of an organised, respectable lobby actively pushing to widen the net gives some sense of just how differently this entire arrangement was understood by the men proposing it than by the women who would eventually pass beneath its reach. By the time the Third Act had settled into practice, a woman living in one of the affected districts could find herself required to register at the discretion of police who had never met her as a common prostitute, and to submit thereafter to a medical inspection roughly every 2 weeks for as long as the authorities deemed necessary. Fail to appear, and a warrant could be issued for her arrest. Once registered, a woman's name entered a system that was, in its own bureaucratic way, remarkably difficult to leave. Removing a name from the register generally required her to demonstrate, again to the satisfaction of officials predisposed to doubt her, that she had genuinely reformed and taken up respectable employment elsewhere. For a woman with few resources and fewer alternatives, respectable employment was often exactly the thing that had been foreclosed to her the moment her name was first entered, since prospective employers who learned of a woman's registration under the Acts had every reason to turn her away rather than risk their own establishment's reputation. The system, once it had you, made the path back out of it narrower with almost every step. The language of the Act itself repays close reading because Victorian legislative prose had a way of wrapping enormous power in the driest possible phrasing, as though dry phrasing alone could make the power feel smaller. The statute spoke of women who might reasonably be believed to be common prostitutes, empowered a metropolitan police officer or any other police officer to apply to a magistrate for an order, and provided that the woman so ordered should be subject to a periodical examination for such a period, not exceeding 1 year, as the justice should direct. Read quickly, it sounds almost administrative, a matter of forms and periods and justices directing things. Read slowly, with an eye for what each clause actually authorized against a specific, real woman. It is considerably harder to mistake for anything other than what it was. It is worth pausing on the mechanics of that examination itself, briefly and without indulgence, because the mechanics are the entire point. A woman brought in under the Acts, whether by voluntary appearance or by force, would be examined internally, using an instrument that had only recently become standard in gynecological practice, by a police surgeon she had almost certainly never met and had no power to refuse. The examinations were frequently described, even at the time, even by men who supported the Acts, as painful. They were, by any modern definition, and by the definition of a fair number of contemporaries too, a form of assault carried out with the full authority of the state. None of this, on its own, fully explains why an ordinary seamstress, or a domestic servant, or a flower seller, a woman who had never in her life sold anything but flowers, needed to fear the hour of 11 o'clock on her walk home. For that, you have to understand the single most consequential word in the entire piece of legislation, not disease, not examination, not hospital, the word that decided everything, that turned a law aimed at one narrow population into a shadow falling across almost every woman who used those streets after dark, was smaller than all of those and far more dangerous. The word was suspected. The Acts never defined with any real precision what made a woman suspicious enough to warrant arrest. There was no checklist a constable carried in his pocket, no fixed criteria a magistrate was required to apply before granting an examination order. The entire structure rested on the judgment of individual men, and individual men, it turned out, judged very broadly indeed. In practice, the qualities that drew police attention were painfully mundane. Being out alone after a certain hour, walking without any obvious errand, or an errand a constable did not care to believe, wearing clothing a little too worn, or occasionally a little too fine for the street she was on, speaking to a soldier or sailor, even briefly, even for directions. Simply being recognized as poor in a poor part of town at an hour when poor women were assumed, by the men paid to police them, to have only one reason left to be outside. Special plainclothes officers were assigned in some of the subjected towns specifically to identify women for examination, moving through the streets in ordinary dress so as not to be recognized as police at all until the moment they made an approach. A woman going about her evening had no way of knowing from one shadowed doorway to the next whether the man watching her was a stranger with unwanted intentions, an ordinary neighbor, or an officer of the state deciding in that moment what category of woman she belonged to. Once identified, a woman's most reliable path out of the machinery was, perversely, submission. Fighting the accusation, demanding a proper hearing, insisting on her own respectability, tended to prolong the process and draw more attention rather than less. Many women, faced with the choice between a public struggle that would mark them permanently in the eyes of their neighbors and a quiet, humiliating examination followed by release, chose the examination. The system was built, whether by design or simple convenience, to reward compliance and punish resistance, which is a shape familiar to almost every unjust system in history. It is worth naming plainly exactly who these plainclothes officers tended to be, because their identity mattered enormously to how the system was experienced on the ground. They were, for the most part, ordinary constables temporarily assigned to a special detail, given wide latitude and very little supervision, evaluated in some measure by the number of women they successfully brought before a magistrate. This created, whether anyone in authority intended it or not, a quiet incentive to cast the net widely rather than narrowly. A constable who returned from his rounds night after night with nothing to report was a less useful constable in the eyes of a system built around the assumption that vigilance would naturally produce results than one who brought in a steady, visible stream of women for examination. The incentive did not need to be stated out loud in any official memorandum for every officer on the beat to understand it perfectly well. Consider what this meant for a woman who was, by any honest account, entirely innocent of the accusation levelled at her. A milliner's assistant finishing a late order, a widow doing piecework by candlelight until her eyes gave out, then walking the half-mile home because an omnibus fare was money she did not have, a young wife bringing supper to a husband on night duty at the docks. None of these women were prostitutes. All of them, on the wrong street, in the wrong light, in front of the wrong constable, could be stopped, questioned, and in the worst cases, formally accused. And here the law's design revealed its cruelest feature. Once accused, a woman bore the burden of proving her own respectability rather than the state bearing the burden of proving her guilt. This inverted the ordinary presumption of English law almost entirely. A man accused of theft was presumed innocent until the evidence said otherwise. A woman accused under these acts of being a common prostitute was, in the practical experience of the women involved, presumed a prostitute until she could somehow demonstrate, to the satisfaction of men who had already decided to suspect her, that she was not. How does a woman prove such a thing? It is worth sitting with the sheer strangeness of the demand. Character witnesses helped if she had employers or clergymen willing to speak for her and willing to be seen doing so, which was itself a risk to their own reputations by association. A respectable address helped, if she had one, and if the constable cared to check it before rather than after the damage was done. But a great many of the women caught in the machinery had none of these advantages readily to hand. They were precisely the women with the least social capital to spend on defending themselves, which meant the law fell heaviest exactly where resistance was weakest. There is a particular kind of quiet, specific horror in imagining the moment itself. The hand on the arm. The request, phrased as a request but understood by everyone present as an order to come along to the station, the eyes of neighbours at windows, at doorways, already beginning the work of deciding what they had just witnessed and what it meant about the woman being led away. Whatever happened afterward, whatever a magistrate eventually ruled, that walk to the station had already done a portion of its damage. A reputation, once publicly questioned on a lit street in front of people who knew your face, rarely returned entirely intact. The women most exposed to this risk were, unsurprisingly, working-class women, and among them, women who worked in occupations that already required them to be visible, mobile, and unaccompanied. Servants sent on late errands, factory girls walking home from long shifts in poor light, women who worked the docks themselves, selling food or mending nets, or simply living in the crowded lodging houses that clustered around every port. Their ordinary working lives, the very activities that kept food on their tables, placed them again and again in exactly the circumstances the acts had quietly redefined as suspicious. Some occupations proved especially dangerous simply by association. A woman who worked, even briefly, as a barmaid in a public house frequented by soldiers found herself under a heavier cloud of suspicion than a woman who worked, say, in a milliner's shop across town, regardless of what either woman actually did with her evenings. Proximity to garrison life, even entirely innocent proximity, functioned in the eyes of enforcing officers almost like evidence in itself. A woman did not need to be seen doing anything. She needed only to be seen often enough, near enough to the barracks gate, for a constable to begin building a private, unspoken case against her, weeks or months before he ever acted on it. There is a particular kind of record that survives from this period, thin and clinical, but revealing all the same. Registers kept in some of the subjected towns listed the occupations given by women brought in under the Acts, and the range recorded there tells its own quiet story. Domestic servants, laundresses, charwomen, flower sellers. Occasionally, a woman is listed simply as of no occupation, a phrase that in itself reveals how thin the line could be between poverty, unemployment, and presumed prostitution in the eyes of the men keeping the ledger. A woman between positions between one household's employ and the next, without a fixed situation to point to when questioned, was exactly the kind of woman the acts were most likely to catch, and least equipped to release without lasting damage. Middle-class women were not, on paper, exempt from the law's language. In practice, they were largely exempt from its attention, for reasons that had less to do with legal protection and more to do with visible markers of class. A woman in good boots, a proper coat, an umbrella of the right quality, moving with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had never had to justify her presence anywhere, drew a different kind of look from a constable than a woman in a thin shawl and broken shoes. The law claimed to be about suspected conduct. In the hands of the men who enforced it, it was very often, in practice, about visible poverty. Age offered no real protection either, a detail that troubled even some contemporaries who otherwise had little sympathy for the women caught up in the system. Girls as young as 14 or 15 appear in the surviving records, swept into the same machinery built, on paper, to police adult prostitution. A girl old enough to be sent out on an errand after dark, but young enough that the very concept of consent, sexual or otherwise, had barely begun to apply to her in any legal sense, could still be stopped, questioned, and in some documented cases formally examined if a constable's private judgment placed her in the wrong category. The Acts, in this respect, sat uneasily beside the very same English law that would eventually be reformed. In the Age of Consent campaign, this story will return to shortly, out of concern for exactly the kind of vulnerable, unprotected girlhood the Acts themselves so often failed to shield. Some women, faced with a summons they knew they could not survive without lasting damage, tried appealing directly to whatever sympathetic figure of authority they could find: a clergyman, a former employer, a doctor known locally for his fairness, hoping a respected voice might intervene on their behalf before a magistrate. This sometimes worked, particularly for women who could produce a genuinely unbroken record of respectable service and a witness willing to vouch loudly and publicly for their character. It worked considerably less often for women without such connections, which meant, once again, that the protection theoretically available under the law was distributed not according to actual innocence or guilt, but according to how much social capital a woman happened to have accumulated before the accusation ever reached her. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the textbooks, because textbooks favour the clean lines of statute over the blurred human edges of enforcement. The Contagious Diseases Acts on the page described a narrow legal category. On the street, in the hands of constables with wide discretion and very little oversight, they described something closer to a general suspicion of poor women out after dark, in certain towns, near certain barracks, at certain hours. And once suspected, once accused, a woman's ordeal had only just begun. The examination itself, and the confinement that could follow it, waited at the end of that walk to the station, in buildings that respectable society preferred not to think about too closely, and that the women who passed through them would remember for the rest of their lives. The word lock, in this context, has nothing to do with hair and nothing gentle about it. Lock hospitals were specialized institutions, some already old by the 1860s, built originally to treat venereal disease among the poor. Under the Contagious Diseases Acts, they took on a second, more troubling purpose. They became places of confinement where women found to be infected could be held, examined, and treated for periods that stretched from weeks into months, entirely against their will if that was how matters stood. A woman brought to a lock hospital under the Acts followed a set procedure that varied only slightly from town to town. She was stripped of her own clothing and issued institutional dress instead, a small detail that carried an outsized weight, since clothing was one of the last remaining markers of who a woman had been before the state took an interest in her. She was bathed under supervision, and then the examinations began in earnest, typically twice each week for the duration of her stay, using the speculum, an instrument that had become the standard tool of the emerging field of gynecology and that a great many women of the period, understandably, dreaded. Between examinations, women confined under the Acts were subjected to prescribed douching, often several times a day, as part of the treatment regime. The average period of confinement ran to roughly 6 weeks, though a good many women were held considerably longer. particularly under the terms of the later Acts, which extended the permissible detention window well beyond what the original 1864 law had allowed. It bears saying plainly and gently, because the women who lived through this deserve both plainness and gentleness in equal measure. This was, by any honest modern description, and by the description offered by a considerable number of outraged contemporaries at the time, a form of institutionalized sexual assault carried out under the full authority of the British state against women who in a great many cases had committed no crime whatsoever beyond being visible, poor, and unlucky enough to be on the wrong street at the wrong hour. The women held inside these hospitals were, for the most part, extraordinarily young. Court and hospital records from the period show large numbers of women in their late teens and early 20s, many of them barely more than girls by any modern reckoning, caught in a system built by grown men who rarely pause to imagine themselves, or their own daughters, on the other side of the examination table. The staff who ran these institutions were themselves an uneven mix. Some matrons and attending physicians appear, in the surviving evidence, to have treated the women in their care with genuine professional decency, doing what they could within an inherently coercive system to make confinement at least bearable. Others treated the women under their supervision with open contempt, viewing them as morally deficient and therefore undeserving of much consideration beyond the strictly clinical. A woman's experience of confinement, in other words, depended enormously on which particular hospital and which particular staff she happened to be assigned to, a variability that mattered enormously to her day-to-day well-being but appears nowhere in the text of the law itself, which treated every lock hospital as functionally interchangeable. Some women, faced with the prospect of confinement, chose to disappear instead, leaving a town entirely rather than submit to registration and its consequences. This carried its own steep cost. Leaving meant abandoning whatever small network of family, friends, and known employers a woman had built up in a particular place, arriving instead in an unfamiliar town with no local reputation to draw on, good or bad, and no established means of proving herself respectable to a new set of neighbors who had never seen her before. It was, in effect, a form of internal exile, undertaken not because a court had ordered it, but because the alternative on offer felt, to the women choosing it, even worse. Think, for a moment, about what those 6 weeks actually contained, beyond the clinical outline of the procedure. 6 weeks away from whatever work had been keeping a woman fed. 6 weeks in which rent went unpaid, in which children, if she had them, were left in the care of neighbours or relatives who might or might not manage the burden with kindness. 6 weeks in which her absence itself became a kind of public announcement, whether or not the details of where she had gone were ever spoken aloud. Neighbours noticed absences. Neighbours drew their own conclusions. A woman could return home months later, formally cleared, and still find that the story of where she had been had arrived at her street corner well ahead of her, and had already been told, retold, and settled into fact by people who had never once asked her version of it. There is very little surviving testimony in the women's own words. This is one of the quieter cruelties of the whole arrangement, and one worth sitting with tonight. The women who endured the lock hospitals were largely working class, largely without the education, the leisure, or the social standing that produces the diaries, letters, and memoirs historians rely on to reconstruct a life from the inside. Their story survives mainly in the words of others, in parliamentary debate, in hospital admission ledgers, listing names, ages, and dates with the flat indifference of an inventory, in the campaign literature of the women who eventually took up their cause, who quoted them when they could, paraphrased them when they could not, and spoke more often than either on their behalf. The lock hospitals themselves varied considerably in condition from town to town. Some had been established decades earlier as ordinary charitable infirmaries treating venereal disease among the poor regardless of gender before the Acts repurposed them specifically for the compulsory detention of women. Others were built or expanded specifically to serve the new legislation, with wards designed as much for security as for medical care, their windows barred not against intruders from outside, but against the possibility of a patient leaving before her period of detention had run its course. Visitors were restricted, and in some institutions barred almost entirely, which meant a woman held for 6 weeks or longer might pass the entire period with no contact whatsoever from family, friends, or anyone from her life outside the hospital walls. Food, bedding, and general conditions inside the lock hospitals were, by most contemporary accounts, adequate rather than punitive in the crudest physical sense, and this detail mattered a great deal to the Act's defenders, who pointed to reasonably clean wards and competent medical staff as evidence that the system was humane. But adequacy of food and bedding says very little about the experience of confinement itself, imposed without meaningful consent, extended sometimes well beyond its original term at the discretion of the examining doctor, and carrying with it a stigma that followed a woman long after she had been formally discharged as cured. A comfortable bed does not undo an involuntary detention, however well the sheets happen to be laundered. It is a strange kind of historical erasure. The women at the very centre of this entire chapter of British law are also, in the surviving record, among its faintest voices. We know, in broad strokes, what was done to them. We know it happened by the thousands, across 2 decades in more than a dozen English and Irish towns. What we mostly do not know, and can only imagine with as much care as the evidence allows, is what any single one of them actually felt, walking into that examination room for the first time, or the 5th, or the 20th. One detail does survive with unusual clarity because it appears again and again in the campaign literature that would eventually bring the Acts down. Doctors and reformers who examined the system closely, including several who had initially supported it, began reporting that the examinations themselves were frequently experienced by the women subjected to them in terms strikingly close to accounts of sexual assault given by women in entirely unrelated circumstances. The shaking, the dissociation, the reluctance, sometimes lasting years, to seek any medical care at all afterward, even for unrelated ailments, because medical care had become, for these women, indistinguishable in memory from violation. This detail mattered enormously to the campaign that would eventually form to oppose the Acts because it reframed the entire debate. The government had built its case around disease, control, and the protection of the armed forces. The women who began organising against the Acts in the late 1860s built their case around something else entirely. Not disease, but dignity. Not the health of soldiers, but the bodily autonomy of women who had never been asked, in any meaningful sense, whether they consented to any part of what was being done to them, from the accusation on the street, to the examination on the table, to the months of confinement that could follow. A handful of doctors who had themselves conducted these examinations under contract to the government eventually became some of the most persuasive voices in the movement against the Acts, precisely because their objections could not be waved away as the squeamishness of outsiders unfamiliar with medical necessity. These were men who had performed the procedure themselves hundreds of times and who came, over years of practice, to conclude that what they were being asked to do bore only a thin resemblance to ordinary medical care and a much closer resemblance to punishment dressed in a doctor's coat. Their testimony, when it eventually reached parliamentary committees and royal commissions, carried a weight that testimony from campaigners alone could never quite match, precisely because it came from inside the system rather than from its critics on the outside. It would take years for that reframing to gather enough force to matter in Parliament. Before it could, the fear the Acts had planted needed to spread, quietly and thoroughly, through every town they touched, and well beyond the 11 original districts marked out in 1864. That spread, and the particular shape it took in the daily lives of ordinary women who had never come anywhere near a lock hospital, is where the story turns next. A woman did not experience the Contagious Diseases Acts alone, even when the examination room itself held only her and a police surgeon. Behind almost every name entered on a lock hospital register stood a small, precarious household, arranged around her presence the way most working-class households of the period were arranged, on thin margins and constant improvisation, and her sudden absence rippled outward through that household in ways the law never troubled itself to consider. Consider the ordinary economics of a working woman's life in one of the subjected towns. Rent was due weekly, sometimes daily, collected by a landlord or his agent with little patience for explanations. Food was bought in small quantities day by day because there was rarely money enough or storage enough to buy in bulk. A woman's wages, however meagre, were frequently the difference between a household eating that week and a household going without, particularly in the many cases where she was a widow, or her husband was himself away at sea, or simply absent in the way men of limited means so often were from families they could not adequately support. Remove that woman from her household for 6 weeks or 3 months or longer, and the arithmetic collapsed almost immediately. Rent went unpaid, and unpaid rent in Victorian England carried real consequences, from the loss of a tenancy to the seizure of what few possessions a family owned. Children too young to earn their own keep faced a stark set of options, none of them good. A neighbour might take them in, out of charity, or in exchange for whatever small service the family could still offer in return. An older sibling might be pulled from whatever schooling she had into full-time work years before it was intended. In the harder cases, children ended up, at least temporarily, in the parish workhouse system, a fate that carried its own long shadow of stigma and hardship, and one that a mother detained under the Acts had no power whatsoever to prevent. None of this appears in the official record of the Contagious Diseases Acts, because none of it was ever the law's official concern. The Acts were written and administered as a matter of public health and police procedure, narrowly defined, and the human wreckage radiating outward from each individual detention was treated, when it was acknowledged at all, as an unfortunate but unavoidable side effect, rather than a cost the system itself had any obligation to weigh. It is worth imagining for a moment the specific shape of a single household's crisis. A mother of 3, detained under the Acts for a period of 2 months. Her eldest daughter, 12 years old, taken out of the small dame school she had been attending and put to work minding younger children for a neighbouring family, in exchange for a share of that family's bread. Her 2 younger children, 4 and 6, passed between whichever relatives or neighbours could spare the room, sleeping some nights on borrowed floors, eating whatever could be scraped together. When the mother finally returned, cleared and released, she returned not to the household she had left, but to one already reshaped by 2 months of her absence. Debts accumulated, arrangements made without her that would take considerable effort to unmake, and a reputation in the neighbourhood that no clean bill of health from the Lock Hospital could fully repair. This is why the campaign against the Acts, once it gathered real momentum, so often framed its argument not purely in terms of individual women's suffering, significant as that was, but in terms of the wider social fabric the Acts were quietly unravelling. Josephine Butler and her fellow campaigners understood from direct contact with affected families that the true cost of the system extended in a wide radius from every examination room, touching children who had committed no offence at all and households already balanced on the thinnest possible margin between stability and collapse. There is a particular cruelty, too, in how the system's economic damage reinforced the very suspicion that had triggered it in the first place. A woman who lost her lodging, her employment references, and her standing in the neighbourhood as a direct result of detention under the Acts often found herself with genuinely fewer respectable options afterward than she had possessed before, regardless of whether the original accusation against her had ever held any truth at all. Some women, having lost everything the accusation had cost them, did eventually turn to exactly the trade the law had wrongly accused them of pursuing, not because the examination had somehow proven anything true about their character, but because the examination itself, and everything that followed from it, had closed off the more respectable alternatives that might otherwise have remained open to her. The system, in this grim sense, occasionally manufactured the very outcome it claimed to be preventing, out of the wreckage it left behind in innocent women's lives. Employers, too, played their own quiet part in extending the damage well past the 6 weeks a woman actually spent inside the Lock Hospital. A landlord or shopkeeper who employed a woman later found to have been detained under the Acts faced a choice of his own, between keeping her on and risking his own establishment's reputation among customers who might disapprove, or dismissing her and finding someone new. A great many employers chose the second option, not necessarily out of any personal moral judgment, but out of simple commercial caution, the same caution that led respectable households to avoid hiring servants with even a whisper of scandal attached to their names. A woman's economic survival in this world depended enormously on a reputation that the Acts could shatter in a single afternoon, and that no subsequent medical clearance could ever fully restore. It is worth remembering, too, that this economic wreckage rarely stayed confined to a single household. Neighbourhoods in the affected towns were tightly woven, interdependent places, where women routinely relied on one another for childcare, for small loans of food or coal in a hard week, for the countless informal exchanges that allowed working families to survive at all on wages that left almost nothing in reserve. When one woman in such a network was removed for weeks or months at a time, the strain did not simply vanish. It redistributed itself across the neighbors who absorbed her children, her debts, and her share of whatever mutual obligations had bound the street together, until the whole small economy of favors and support had been quietly reshaped by a single arrest that most of those neighbors had had no part in causing and no power to prevent. History left us no name for her, so we will use none, rather than inventing one that was never truly hers. Picture her only as one woman among the thousands who actually passed through this system, composed from the pattern the surviving records leave behind, rather than from any single documented case. She is perhaps 19. She works most weeks, taking in laundry for several households near the dockyard, carrying heavy baskets through streets she has walked every day of her working life. The notice, when it comes, arrives quietly, the way most bureaucratic cruelty tends to arrive. A constable she does not recognize stops her one evening, not roughly, not even particularly unkindly by his own estimation, and tells her she has been named. She does not entirely understand at first what being named means, only that she is now expected to present herself at a certain building on a certain day for an examination she has no power to decline without risking arrest. The days between that notice and the appointment itself carry their own particular weight, one that rarely makes it into the parliamentary record, but that must have shaped countless women's lives all the same. There is the question of who to tell and whether to tell anyone at all. There is the work that cannot simply stop, the laundry baskets that still need carrying, the customers who must not sense that anything has changed, because a laundress's livelihood depends entirely on her customers continuing to trust her with their linens. There is, above all, the waiting, and the particular kind of dread that waiting for an appointment you cannot refuse tends to produce. On the appointed day, she presents herself at the designated building, sometimes a dedicated examination house, sometimes a wing of the Lock Hospital itself, and waits, along with other women in the same circumstance, in a corridor that offers no privacy and very little comfort. Some of the women waiting with her are frightened. Some have been through this before and wear an expression that is harder to read, something closer to a hardened patience than to fear, the particular composure a person develops after enough repetitions of the same ordeal. The examination itself, conducted by a police surgeon she has never met and will likely never see again, lasts only a few minutes by the clock, though the surviving accounts of women and sympathetic doctors alike describe those minutes as feeling considerably longer. We will not describe the procedure itself in clinical detail here. It is enough, and it is true, to say plainly what a great many contemporaries, including doctors who performed the procedure themselves and later spoke out against it, eventually concluded that this was an invasive, non-consensual act carried out under threat of imprisonment, and that its resemblance to sexual assault was not a coincidence of language chosen by outraged campaigners, but a description a considerable number of the women who experienced it, and the professionals who administered it, arrived at independently from direct experience. If she is found clear, she is released, permitted to return to her laundry baskets and her customers, though not without the knowledge that she may well be summoned again in a fortnight's time and the fortnight after that, for as long as her name remains on the register. If she is found infected, a different sequence begins, one this story has already traced in an earlier chapter: the institutional clothing, the confinement, the douching regimen, the slow passage of weeks inside walls she did not choose to enter. It matters, in telling this part of the story, to resist two opposite temptations. The first is to render her only as a symbol, a stand-in for an argument, stripped of anything that might make her recognizably human rather than merely illustrative. The second, just as real a risk, is to imagine her interior life in more vivid, specific detail than the evidence actually allows, inventing thoughts and words she never spoke simply because the silence in the record is uncomfortable to sit with. The honest path lies somewhere between those two temptations. We can say with confidence what was done to women like her because the mechanics of the acts are extremely well documented. We can say, with somewhat less confidence but real historical grounding, how doctors and reformers who witnessed the aftermath described its effects: the shaking, the lasting reluctance to seek medical care of any kind, the particular quality of fear that seemed to settle over women who had been through the process more than once. What we cannot honestly claim to know is the precise inner texture of any one woman's private experience, because she was never asked to record it, and the society around her was never inclined to preserve it if she had. This is, in its own way, one of the deepest injustices sitting inside this entire story, deeper even than the examinations themselves. Not only were these women's bodies treated as subject to state control without their consent, their own testimony about what that control felt like was treated by the society that imposed it as almost entirely unnecessary to collect. The Acts generated enormous volumes of paperwork, registers, admission records, medical reports, parliamentary debates, running to hundreds of printed pages. Almost none of it consists of the women's own words, offered in their own voice, describing their own experience in whatever way they themselves might have chosen to describe it. When Josephine Butler and her fellow campaigners began collecting testimony directly from affected women in the late 1860s and through the 1870s, they were doing something that had simply not occurred to the original architects of the Acts to do at all. They sat with women in their own homes, in workhouse infirmaries, in the back rooms of sympathetic lodging houses, and asked them directly what had happened and what it had felt like. Some of what they gathered made its way into the Shield and into the pamphlets and parliamentary submissions the campaign produced over the years. It represents even now one of the only substantial bodies of evidence in which the women subjected to the Acts speak, however imperfectly filtered through a sympathetic interviewer's own pen in something closer to their own voice. This act of simply asking and then simply listening sounds almost too modest to count as a political strategy, and yet it proved to be one of the campaign's most effective tools. A parliamentary committee full of men could dismiss abstract arguments about liberty and consent with relative ease. It proved considerably harder to dismiss a specific, carefully recorded account of a specific woman's specific ordeal, especially once enough such accounts had accumulated that they could no longer be waved away as isolated, unrepresentative complaints. Butler understood perhaps better than any other reformer of her generation that the most persuasive evidence against an abstract system is rarely another abstraction. It is a particular, human, unforgettable detail offered in a voice that refuses to be summarized into something more comfortable to hear. That is why this chapter carries no name and offers no invented dialogue, and asks you instead simply to hold the shape of the ordeal in mind, the notice, the wait, the walk to the examination room, the minutes that lasted longer than minutes should, the release or the confinement that followed. It happened, by conservative estimate, to tens of thousands of women across the 2 decades the Acts remained in force. Most of them left no further trace in any record we can now consult. The absence of their voices is not evidence that their experience was minor. It is evidence only of how little value their own testimony was thought at the time to carry. Only 11 towns fell under the original Act. By the time the Third Act had taken effect, the number of subjected districts had grown, but it still amounted to a modest fraction of England's towns and cities. A woman living in Manchester or York or a quiet market town nowhere near a naval yard was never, in the strict legal sense, at risk of the examinations this story has spent its last 2 chapters describing. And yet the lesson of the Acts did not stay confined to the towns where the Acts applied. This is one of the quieter, harder to trace effects of the whole episode, and one of the most important. Laws shape behavior even in the places they do not technically reach, because news of them travels, because newspapers reported on parliamentary debates and court cases with at least occasional candor, and because the underlying attitude the Acts expressed, that an unaccompanied woman after dark was a woman whose respectability could reasonably be questioned, did not require a specific statute to spread. It simply needed to be said loudly enough by people with enough authority for long enough. Consider the chaperonage rules already sitting quietly in place before 1864 ever passed. Young women were already expected, by every etiquette manual worth its binding, never to go about a city street unaccompanied. The Contagious Diseases Acts did not invent that expectation. What the Acts did was give it teeth in specific places, and in doing so, they hardened an existing social custom into something closer to a felt national anxiety. If the state itself in certain towns treated an unaccompanied woman after dark as a candidate for arrest, it became just a little easier for every landlady, every employer, every worried parent in every town in England to treat the same behaviour as evidence of poor character, whether or not the Acts had ever technically reached their particular street. Nowhere is this spillover effect easier to trace than in London's West End, a district that fell entirely outside the subjected zones of the Contagious Diseases Acts, and that nonetheless developed, over the same decades, its own version of the same basic problem. As the West End grew into a great commercial hub in the later Victorian period, drawing in wealthy shoppers, middle-class clerks, and working women of every description, it also drew a particular kind of male attention that had nothing to do with any statute at all. Women who wrote to the popular press in these years described being followed for entire city blocks by well-dressed men, being blocked quite deliberately on a crowded pavement, being spoken to in what one correspondent to the Pall Mall Gazette called a most hateful manner by men the same letter dryly described as so-called gentlemen. These were not accusations of prostitution in the legal sense the Acts described. They were something related but distinct, an entrenched, casual assumption shared by a great many men of every class that a woman moving through public space alone was available, in some general sense, for comment, pursuit, or worse. One woman, describing her frustration to a policeman on duty, asked directly why he did not clear away the men who prowled about the streets and squares harassing passers-by. His reported answer says almost everything you need to know about where real institutional sympathy lay in this period. Those, he told her, were the gentlemen who lived in the big houses nearby. What did she think his own position would be worth, he asked, if he moved against them? The historian Judith Walkowitz, who has done more than perhaps anyone to reconstruct this particular corner of Victorian London life from the surviving letters and newspaper correspondence of the period, has described the West End of these decades as a genuinely contested space, one where the new commercial culture of shopping and public leisure was actively reshaping who was allowed to move through central London and on what terms. Middle-class women were, for the first time in any real numbers, claiming the right to browse a department store window, take tea unaccompanied, or simply walk for pleasure through fashionable streets that had once been considered the natural territory of men alone. The harassment those women faced was in part a backlash against exactly that claim, an attempt by a certain kind of man to remind women that their presence in public space, however fashionable the shop windows, remained conditional on male tolerance rather than settled as a right. There, in a single exchange between one frightened woman and one indifferent constable, sits the entire architecture of the problem this story is built around. The law formerly targeted poor women suspected of prostitution in a small number of garrison towns. But the deeper current beneath the law, the assumption that a woman's presence in public after dark was itself provisional, subject to male judgment and male convenience, touched every woman in England who ever had to walk anywhere alone. The wealthy woman harassed on a West End pavement and the poor woman stopped by a plain-clothes officer near the Portsmouth docks were, in a real sense, living inside the same set of assumptions, even though only one of them faced the machinery of arrest and examination. Both were being told, in different registers by different men in different parts of the country, that their freedom to simply exist in public space after a certain hour was conditional and that the condition was set entirely by someone else. This is a good place to pause the story itself for a moment, quietly, without breaking the thread of it. There is a small library of stories, very much like this one, narrated in full and gathered together, over on Spotify now, if you would rather close your eyes completely and simply listen tonight. You will find the link waiting in the description below and pinned in the comments whenever you want it. For now, let the room stay dim and let us go back to England, because the women living inside these assumptions did not stay silent about them forever. It is worth noting, too, how unevenly the fear settled even among working women, because poverty was never a single flat category in Victorian England. A domestic servant, living inside her employer's household, moved through the city on errands at hours her mistress dictated, with very little control over her own schedule and very little power to refuse an errand that happened to fall after dark. A factory girl, finishing a shift that ran until 9 or 10 at night, depending on the season and the order book, had almost no choice in the matter at all. Her walk home was not a decision, it was a condition of her employment, imposed by an owner who bore none of the risk himself. American visitors to Europe during this period sometimes remarked with a certain relief on how differently unaccompanied women could be treated depending on which city they found themselves in. One American travel writer, describing conditions in Paris in the 1870s, noted that a lady of youth and personal attractions was, only a year or two earlier, sure to be accosted the moment she attempted to go out alone, persistently followed by loitering young men along the boulevards. He credited a firmer approach from the Paris police and a wave of visiting American women unwilling to tolerate the treatment quietly, with improving matters enough that ladies could soon move about the fashionable districts singly or in pairs with what he called perfect immunity. The comparison he drew, tellingly, was to the streets of Baltimore and Broadway, suggesting that even his own country's largest cities were, in his estimation, no safer for an unaccompanied woman than the worst of what Europe had to offer. Safety, in other words, was never a simple matter of one nation being enlightened and another backward. It was a patchwork, city by city, street by street, shaped as much by how vigorously local police chose to intervene as by any broader national character. Some employers understood this dynamic well enough to exploit it quietly for their own advantage. A factory owner who kept his workers past dark, knowing full well the risks and social costs his female employees bore on the walk home, rarely felt obliged to provide any form of escort, transport, or additional pay to offset that risk. The danger was simply absorbed by the workers themselves, treated as an unfortunate but unavoidable feature of the job, in the same unexamined way that low wages and long hours were treated as unavoidable features of the job. It cost the factory nothing. It cost the women walking home a great deal, paid out over years in quickened footsteps, altered routes, and a low, constant hum of vigilance that never fully switched off. And so the same women whose labour was most essential to England's growing industrial economy were, again and again, the women most exposed to a legal and social framework that treated their necessary presence on the street as a moral liability. There is a bitter irony sitting quietly inside this arrangement, one that the reformers who eventually took up the cause would return to again and again. The very economy that depended on women working late, walking unaccompanied, moving freely through public space to reach factories and shops and the homes of their employers, had also built a legal and cultural apparatus that treated exactly that freedom of movement as evidence against them. It took a particular kind of woman to look at this arrangement clearly, name it for what it was, and decide to spend the better part of 2 decades of her own life dismantling it. She did not come from the ranks of the women most directly harmed. She came, in fact, from precisely the class of respectable, sheltered, chaperoned English womanhood that the Acts were never meant to touch at all. Her name was Josephine Butler, and her involvement in this story did not begin with politics. It began, as so many of the fiercest campaigns in history do, with grief. Of all the towns the Contagious Diseases Acts touched, none carried the weight of the law quite so heavily as the 2 great naval strongholds of Portsmouth and Plymouth. Between them, these 2 ports had for generations supplied much of the manpower and infrastructure behind Britain's command of the sea, and by the 1860s, both had grown into dense, bustling, thoroughly military towns, their economies, their street layouts, and their very rhythms of daily life shaped almost entirely around the needs of the fleet. Picture Portsmouth on an ordinary evening in this period. The dockyard dominates the waterfront, its high walls enclosing acres of workshops, storehouses, and the great stone basins where ships of the line were built, repaired, and provisioned. Beyond those walls sprawls a dense warren of streets built up specifically to house and entertain the thousands of sailors and marines who passed through the port, streets lined with public houses, boarding houses, pawnbrokers, and the countless small trades that grew up to serve a transient population of young men with wages in their pockets and, for the moment, nowhere urgent to be. It was here, in streets with names like Queen Street and Landport, that the machinery of the Contagious Diseases Acts operated with its greatest intensity. Local police, working the same beats night after night, grew to recognize faces, patterns, and rumors with an intimacy that smaller, more anonymous cities could never quite match. This intimacy cut both ways. It meant in some cases that officers came to know which women were genuinely working the trade and which were not, and could exercise a rough discretion accordingly. It also meant that reputation, once established in a particular street or a particular public house, proved almost impossible to shake, regardless of whether the reputation had ever been accurate in the first place. Plymouth, further west, told a similar story around its own dockyard at Devonport, where the same basic pattern repeated itself with only local variation. Steep, narrow streets climbing away from the harbour, densely packed lodging houses, and a constabulary charged with policing a population that swelled and contracted with the arrival and departure of the fleet, in ways that made any fixed, stable sense of who belonged on a given street, on a given night, extraordinarily difficult to maintain. When the compulsory examinations were finally suspended in 1883, some supporters of the Acts pointed almost immediately to conditions in towns like Portsmouth and Plymouth as evidence that repeal had been a mistake. Reports reaching Parliament in the years afterward described what was called a deplorable state of affairs on certain streets in both towns, disorder and open solicitation that the Act's defenders argued had been kept in check, however imperfectly, by the old system of registration and inspection. Opponents of the Acts countered that any such disorder had far more to do with ordinary policing and municipal responsibility, the state of street lighting, the licensing of public houses, the basic provision of order and decency that any garrison town owed its own citizens, than with the presence or absence of compulsory medical examinations for women. It is worth noticing what this argument on both sides quietly reveals. Neither camp disputed that Portsmouth and Plymouth faced real problems of public order around their dockyards. What they disputed was whose responsibility those problems were and whose bodies should bear the cost of managing them. The Acts had offered one answer for nearly 2 decades: place the burden almost entirely on the women through registration, examination and confinement, and leave the men who created the demand for their services and the municipal authorities responsible for the wider condition of the streets largely untouched by comparison. The repeal did not resolve this underlying disagreement. It simply removed one particular, deeply flawed attempt at an answer and left the harder, more honest question about shared responsibility for a shared social problem sitting unresolved for the next generation to take up in its own way. Local clergy in both towns occupied a particularly uncomfortable position throughout this entire period, caught between a congregation that included the very women the Acts targeted and a broader religious establishment that, for the most part, either supported the Acts outright or preferred not to discuss the matter from the pulpit at all. A handful of individual clergymen in Portsmouth and Plymouth did speak out, quietly at first, and then with growing conviction, as the repeal campaign gathered strength nationally, arguing that a church claiming to minister to the poor and the fallen could not comfortably stand by while the state subjected exactly those women to what amounted to state-sanctioned violation. Their voices rarely carried as far as Butler's own, but they mattered locally, in towns where a sympathetic clergyman's opinion could shift the wider climate of local opinion in ways a distant newspaper campaign, however well organized, sometimes struggled to reach. Walk those same streets today, in Portsmouth or in Plymouth, and almost nothing remains to mark what happened there. The dockyards still stand, transformed now into museums and heritage sites where visitors come to admire preserved warships rather than to reflect on the women who once lived and worked in the streets just beyond the dockyard gates. No plaque names the lock hospitals. No memorial marks the police court where so many women once stood, waiting to learn which way a magistrate's private judgment would fall. The streets themselves have been rebuilt, repaved, and renamed more than once in the century and a half since. What survives is mostly paper, registers, parliamentary reports, and the occasional line in a local newspaper describing an arrest, a time, a place, with the same brief indifference given to any other item of small-town business, and giving almost no hint at all of the frightened ordinary woman standing at the very centre of the report. It is worth imagining, too, the particular texture of a naval town's evenings during this period, because that texture explains a great deal about why the Acts found such fertile ground there in the first place. When a ship returned from a long deployment, hundreds of young sailors came ashore at once, wages in hand after months at sea with little opportunity to spend them. Public houses filled instantly. Streets that had been quiet for weeks grew loud and crowded within hours, and the ordinary rhythms that governed a smaller, less transient town simply did not apply. Local shopkeepers, publicans, and lodging house keepers built entire seasonal economies around these arrivals, and the women who worked the trade the Acts were built to police were, in many cases, as much a part of that improvised economic ecosystem as the tavern keepers and the pawnbrokers were. This is not offered as an excuse for what the Acts did, but as context for understanding why reform proved so difficult to achieve locally, even after Parliament had acted. Too many local livelihoods, respectable and otherwise, had come to depend on the peculiar economic rhythm a large transient garrison or naval population created, and any serious attempt to address the underlying conditions, better lighting, better policing that treated men and women equally, genuine alternative employment for women who wanted to leave the trade, would have required a far larger and more expensive commitment than a single Act of Parliament ever demanded of the towns themselves. Repeal removed one instrument of control. It left the underlying economic pressures that had shaped Portsmouth's and Plymouth's night streets for generations almost entirely untouched. Josephine Butler was born Josephine Gray in Northumberland in 1828 into a family that had already made a habit of taking unpopular moral positions seriously. Her father was an outspoken advocate against slavery at a time when that position still required real conviction to hold, and the household Josephine grew up in treated social injustice as a subject worth discussing at the dinner table rather than avoiding politely. As a young woman, she travelled to Ireland during the worst years of the famine, and what she witnessed there, the scale of human suffering met so often with official indifference, stayed with her for the rest of her life. She married George Butler, an academic and clergyman, in 1852, and the marriage was, by the standards of the age, an unusually equal one. George shared his wife's convictions rather than merely tolerating them, and would go on to support her public campaigning even when friends and colleagues warned him it might cost him his own career. It very nearly did, more than once. In 1864, the same year the first Contagious Diseases Act passed through Parliament with so little public notice, the Butlers suffered a private tragedy that would, in time, redirect the entire shape of Josephine's life. Their young daughter, Ava, died after a fall at only 5 years old. Josephine later wrote of the grief that followed as something close to unbearable, and of a growing need in its aftermath to find some way of turning her own pain outward toward the suffering of others, rather than letting it simply consume her from the inside. She began visiting workhouses. She began speaking, directly and without the usual euphemisms of her class, with women who had turned to prostitution out of simple economic desperation, women with no other visible way to feed themselves or their children. She listened to what they told her about the men in their lives, the circumstances that had brought them to the streets, and the particular contempt with which respectable society treated them afterward, as though poverty itself were a moral failing rather than a circumstance. "It is men," one woman told her, in words Butler would later quote in her own writing, "men, only men, from the first to the last, that we have to do with. To please a man I did wrong at first, then I was flung about from man to man." This work took on a particular shape after 1866, when the Butlers moved to Liverpool following George's appointment as head of Liverpool College. In that city, Josephine took up the cause of girls confined in the Brownlow Hill Workhouse, one of the largest and grimmest institutions of its kind in England, and established what she called a home of rest, a place where women and girls with nowhere else to turn could find shelter, however temporary, outside the workhouse system's harsher discipline. It was in this period, sitting with dying women in the workhouse infirmary, listening to accounts of lives shaped by poverty, exploitation, and a complete absence of legal protection, that Butler's later, more overtly political campaigning first took root. The Contagious Diseases Acts, when she encountered them properly a few years later, did not strike her as an isolated injustice. They struck her as one more instance of a pattern she had already spent years learning to recognize. Alongside this work, Butler and Wolstenholme had already begun collaborating on another front entirely, one that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the Contagious Diseases Acts campaign, but that grew from exactly the same underlying conviction. In 1868, the two women helped establish the Married Women's Property Committee, campaigning against a legal convention under which a married woman's property, including anything she had inherited or earned in her own right, became her husband's the moment she said her vows. The committee's efforts eventually contributed to the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, which for the first time recognized a married woman as a distinct legal entity, capable of owning and controlling property independently of her husband. It is worth noting how closely the logic of that campaign mirrors the logic of everything else this story has described. In both cases, the underlying argument was the same, that a woman's body, her labor, and her possessions belonged as a matter of basic legal principle to herself, and not automatically to whichever man happened to stand nearest her, whether that man was a husband claiming her property or a constable claiming the right to decide, on sight, what she was. By 1869, Butler had become convinced that the Contagious Diseases Acts represented not a regrettable but necessary public health measure, as their defenders insisted, but a profound moral wrong, one that punished women for a shared social problem while leaving the men equally responsible for it entirely untouched. That year, together with a fellow reformer named Elizabeth Wolstenholme, she founded the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Butler brought to this work a particular quality that unsettled her opponents more than almost anything else about her. She refused to speak about prostitution, disease, and the examinations themselves in the softened, indirect language Victorian propriety generally demanded of respectable women discussing such matters, if respectable women were permitted to discuss them at all. She named the procedures plainly. She described, in front of mixed audiences, exactly what a woman experienced during a compulsory examination, using language direct enough that newspaper reports of her speeches sometimes declined to reprint her words in full on the grounds that they were simply too indelicate for a family readership. This directness was, in its own way, a deliberate tactic. Butler understood that the entire system she opposed depended partly on precisely this kind of silence, on a polite unwillingness among respectable people to look closely at what was actually being done to poorer women in their name. Breaking that silence, loudly and specifically, was itself a form of political action. The timing of that founding is itself worth pausing on. A separate mixed-sex organization opposing the acts had already formed and had quietly declined to admit women as full members on the grounds, common enough for the period, that the subject matter was simply too indelicate for ladies to discuss openly. Butler and Wolstenholme's response to being excluded from a campaign about the treatment of women was, in effect, to found a better one, made up entirely of women, willing to discuss precisely the indelicate subject matter the men around them preferred to avoid. It is worth understanding, too, why Butler in particular made such an effective figurehead for this campaign, in a way that a working-class woman making the identical argument almost certainly could not have. She was, by birth and marriage, thoroughly respectable, the wife of a clergyman, a woman whose own conduct offered her critics no obvious opening to attack. This respectability functioned, whether Butler fully intended it or not, as a kind of armor, allowing her to say things about sexuality and the treatment of women's bodies that would have been dismissed instantly, or worse, if spoken by one of the women the acts most directly harmed. It is an uncomfortable truth sitting quietly inside this whole story, that the campaign against a law which punished poor women for their perceived lack of respectability succeeded in significant part because it was led by a woman whose own respectability could not easily be questioned. The system's own logic, in other words, had to be turned against itself, using exactly the currency the system most valued. This decision cost Butler dearly in the currency her own class valued most: respectability. The backlash arrived quickly, and it arrived personally. One London newspaper suggested that women like Mrs. Butler were so discontented in their own homes that they had to find an outlet somewhere and had taken pleasure in a hobby too nasty to mention. A member of Parliament, debating the acts on the floor of the House, described her in terms meant to end the conversation rather than continue it, as worse than the prostitutes she claimed to be defending. Butler kept speaking anyway. She travelled the country delivering public addresses on a subject most respectable women of her era would never have named aloud in mixed company, describing in direct terms exactly what the examinations involved and exactly what they did to the women subjected to them. She did this at genuine personal risk. On more than one occasion, hostile crowds, stirred up by supporters of the acts who had a financial or professional stake in the system Butler was attacking, turned violent at her public meetings. She was, by her own later account and by the accounts of those who travelled with her, physically endangered on several occasions simply for standing up and speaking plainly about what was being done to women in her country's name. In 1870, Butler founded a newspaper of her own called The Shield to serve as the campaign's principal voice. Through its pages and through the tireless organising of the Ladies' National Association's members, the argument against the acts slowly began reaching audiences well beyond the towns where the acts actually applied. The campaign built alliances with working men's organisations, with sympathetic doctors who had grown troubled by what they were being asked to do in the examination rooms, and eventually with a small but growing number of members of Parliament willing to say, on the record, that the acts could not stand. The alliance with working men's organisations deserves particular attention because it cut against almost every expectation of how Victorian political campaigning was supposed to work. Butler and her fellow campaigners were, for the most part, educated, comfortable, and thoroughly middle class. Yet they found some of their most effective allies among trade unionists and working men's political clubs, men who recognised in the acts a broader pattern they knew intimately from their own dealings with employers and magistrates, the pattern of one class of English person having the power to define and punish another almost entirely on suspicion, with very little recourse available to the accused. Working men, many of whom had watched wives, sisters, and daughters live under the general threat the acts represented, proved receptive audiences at public meetings where more comfortable listeners sometimes turned hostile. The Ladies' National Association itself grew over the course of the 1870s into something considerably larger than its founders had likely anticipated at the outset. Local branches formed in towns across England, staffed almost entirely by volunteer women who collected signatures for petitions, distributed pamphlets, and organised the public meetings that carried Butler's message to audiences who would never read the Shield directly. Petitions bearing tens of thousands of signatures were presented to Parliament over the years of the campaign, a scale of organised political pressure remarkable for a movement led entirely by women who could not themselves vote for the members of Parliament they were petitioning. Butler's own writing from this period returns again and again to a particular image, that of ordinary, respectable women, women very much like herself and the readers of her pamphlets, finally being made to understand what was being done in their name and with their implicit consent by virtue of their silence to women only slightly less fortunate than themselves. She wrote often of the shared vulnerability underlying the whole system, the idea that any woman, regardless of class, existed in a body the law felt entitled to police, and that the distance between a comfortable clergyman's wife and a frightened seamstress hauled before a magistrate was considerably thinner than either woman might have assumed before the acts made the connection unavoidable. Progress, when it finally came, arrived slowly and unevenly, the way most real political change tends to arrive. In 1871, a royal commission examined the acts and their operation, and though the commission's findings were mixed, they gave the repeal campaign a level of official legitimacy it had previously lacked. Through the 1870s, public opinion continued shifting, aided by mounting evidence, some of it gathered by doctors who had begun to question openly whether the examinations were even medically effective at reducing disease, let alone morally justifiable in the way they were being carried out. It would take until 1883 for the forced examinations to be suspended, and until 1886, 17 years after Butler and Wolstenholme first founded their association, for the Acts to be formally repealed by Act of Parliament. 17 years is a long time to spend fighting a single law. It is longer still when the fight costs you your reputation, your safety, and very nearly your family's standing in the world, over and over, for the better part of 2 decades. Butler did not stop once the repeal was finally won. She had, by then, spent so long looking closely at how English law and English custom treated the bodies and freedoms of women and girls that she found she could not simply set the work down. Her attention turned next to a danger that had been sitting largely unaddressed beside the one she had just defeated, and it would draw her within a few years of the repeal into one of the most sensational and consequential newspaper campaigns of the entire Victorian era. By the middle of the 1870s, the repeal campaign had grown large enough and stubborn enough that it began pulling in allies from inside Parliament itself, men willing to stake their own political futures on a cause that most of their colleagues still preferred to avoid discussing in polite company. Chief among them was James Stansfeld, a Liberal Member of Parliament who had already served in government and who took up the cause of repeal with a seriousness that would, in time, cost him a great deal of the influence he had spent years building. The timing could hardly have been worse from a purely political standpoint. In 1874, the Liberal government fell, replaced by Benjamin Disraeli's Conservative administration, and with it went whatever modest momentum the repeal campaign had managed to build inside Westminster. Butler herself, in letters from this period, described it bluntly as a year of discouragement, a stretch in which even her most committed allies found their energy and their optimism running thin. Bills to repeal the acts had already been introduced and quietly dropped more than once since the campaign's earliest years, and each failed attempt made the next one just a little harder to mount with any real conviction. It was against this discouraging backdrop that Stansfeld effectively took over parliamentary leadership of the repeal effort, a role that required him to spend years arguing a deeply unpopular position among his own colleagues, many of whom regarded the entire subject as beneath serious legislative attention, or worse, as an embarrassing distraction pressed by hysterical women who did not understand the practical necessities of maintaining a healthy army and navy. Stansfeld's willingness to keep raising the question, session after session, vote after failed vote, mattered enormously to a campaign that depended in the end on changing the mind of the very institution that had created the problem in the first place. Butler, meanwhile, had begun looking beyond England's own borders, convinced that the fight against regulated prostitution could not be won in Britain alone, while similar systems continued operating openly across continental Europe, offering a ready-made model that pro-regulation voices in England could always point to as evidence and precedent. In the winter of 1874 into 1875, she travelled through France, Italy, and Switzerland, meeting with reformers, interviewing officials, and visiting the institutions where regulated prostitution was already firmly established. One visit in particular left a lasting mark on her. In Paris, she toured a women's prison and hospital known as Saint-Lazare, where women accused of prostitution under the French system were held under conditions she found so distressing that she could, by her own account, barely bring herself to describe them afterward. The tour left her exhausted, and she was forced to rest for some time upon her return to England, worried the entire while that her continental efforts might collapse without her constant personal attention to keep them moving. They did not collapse. The relationships and momentum she had built during those difficult months of travel held and helped lay the groundwork for something considerably larger than a single English repeal campaign. In March of 1875, at a meeting in Liverpool, that groundwork became a formal organisation, the British Continental and General Federation for the Abolition of Government Regulation of Prostitution, later renamed the International Abolitionist Federation. James Stansfeld became its first president. Butler served as honorary secretary, and a Sheffield radical named Henry Joseph Wilson served as corresponding secretary, coordinating an increasingly wide network of reformers scattered across Britain and continental Europe, all working toward the same basic goal: the dismantling of state systems that policed and confined women's bodies in the name of public health. The Federation gave the English Repeal campaign something it had lacked before, a sense that the fight in Westminster was not an isolated, peculiarly English argument, but one front in a much larger international struggle. Reformers in France, Italy, and elsewhere on the continent, watching Britain's campaign with real interest, drew encouragement in turn from every advance the English movement managed to make, and Butler's continental tours helped seed similar campaigns that would, over the following decades, spread the abolitionist argument well beyond the borders of any single country. None of this made the parliamentary fight in London any easier or any faster. Repeal bills continued to be introduced, debated, and defeated or withdrawn through much of the later 1870s, with Stansfeld and his shrinking but determined circle of allies absorbing defeat after defeat without ever quite abandoning the effort entirely. It is worth remembering, when a story like this one eventually arrives at its victorious conclusion, just how many years of dead ends, stalled votes, and general discouragement stood between the campaign's founding in 1869 and the eventual suspension of the examinations in 1883. Persistence, in this story, as in so many others, was not a single dramatic virtue displayed at one decisive moment. It was a long, grinding, largely unglamorous habit, practiced year after year by people who had every reasonable justification to give up and simply did not. Stansfeld himself paid a real professional price for his years of leadership on this question. Colleagues who had once considered him a natural candidate for further high office came over time to regard him instead as a man permanently associated with an uncomfortable, faintly disreputable cause, however principled his stance on it might have been. He continued to serve in Parliament for years afterward, and continued to be respected by those who shared his convictions, but the particular kind of advancement that might once have seemed available to him never fully materialized in the same way again. He is remembered today, when he is remembered at all outside specialist historical circles, almost entirely for this one long, difficult fight, rather than for the broader political career that fight arguably cost him. There are worse legacies a person could leave behind, and it is worth naming his sacrifice plainly here, alongside the women's, because the campaign against the Acts asked real costs of its allies inside Parliament, as well as its organisers outside it, and Stansfeld paid his without ever once, by any surviving account, expressing regret for having done so. It is worth pausing too on why a man in Stansfeld's position chose to take up this particular fight at all, when a great many other causes might have offered him an easier path to the same reputation for principle. The clearest answer, drawn from his own recorded statements and from the accounts of those who worked alongside him, is simply that he had come to view the Acts, once he examined them closely, as a plain violation of the basic liberties English law claimed to guarantee every citizen. a violation made possible only because the citizens in question were women, and poor women at that. Stansfeld belonged to a broader tradition of Victorian liberal politics that took the language of individual liberty seriously enough to occasionally follow it into genuinely unpopular places, and the Contagious Diseases Acts, examined honestly through that lens, offered about as clear a case of state overreach against individual liberty as Victorian England had to show. That he was willing to follow the logic of his own professed principles all the way to its uncomfortable conclusion at real cost to himself is precisely what made him useful to a campaign that badly needed exactly this kind of principled, occasionally inconvenient ally. The Federation Butler and Stansfeld built in Liverpool that spring outlived the specific fight it had been founded to support. Long after the Contagious Diseases Acts themselves had been struck from the English statute books, the International Abolitionist Federation continued operating, turning its attention to similar systems still functioning in other countries, and eventually, in the 20th century, to the broader question of trafficking in women and girls across international borders. A single Liverpool meeting in March of 1875, convened by a handful of committed reformers who had every reason to expect only modest local results, had in fact planted something that would keep growing for well over a century afterward in forms its original founders could scarcely have imagined. In the years just after the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed, Josephine Butler turned a portion of her remaining energy toward a danger that had been sitting, largely unspoken, alongside the one she had just spent 17 years dismantling. Under English law as it stood in the mid-1880s, the age of consent for girls was 13 years old. Campaigners including Butler had grown convinced that this left children shockingly exposed to exploitation, and that Parliament, having only just been dragged into confronting one uncomfortable truth about the treatment of women and girls, would need to be dragged into confronting another. Butler found an ally in William Thomas Stead, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, the same newspaper whose letters pages had, a decade earlier, carried ordinary women's complaints about street harassment in the West End. Stead wanted to prove, in the most direct and undeniable way possible, exactly how easy it was under existing law for a child to be bought for the purposes of exploitation. Butler helped connect him with Rebecca Jarrett, a woman who had once worked in the trade herself and had since left it, who agreed to help demonstrate the ease of the transaction Stead wanted to expose. The resulting investigation was published in the summer of 1885 under the title The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, and it detonated across British public life with a force few newspaper series before or since have ever matched. Stead was arrested and briefly imprisoned, on the grounds that the demonstration itself had technically broken the very law it was exposing. But the public reaction to what his articles revealed proved impossible for Parliament to ignore. Within weeks of publication, lawmakers who had spent years resisting any change to the age of consent voted to raise it from 13 to 16. Rebecca Jarrett's own role in the affair deserves a gentler telling than history has often given her. A woman who had herself once worked in the trade, who had rebuilt a more settled life afterward, she agreed to help Stead's investigation at real risk to that hard-won stability, and she paid for it. When the case went to trial, it was Jarrett, far more than Stead himself, whose past was picked over publicly and used against her credibility, a pattern uncomfortably familiar to anyone who had followed the Contagious Diseases Acts controversy closely. The men who orchestrated a public exposure of a genuine and urgent problem walked away from the affair with their reputations largely intact, or in Stead's case considerably enhanced. The woman whose own history made the demonstration possible in the first place bore the heaviest personal cost of exposing it. It is worth sitting for a moment with the strange arithmetic of that outcome. A law protecting children from sexual exploitation, one of the most fundamental protections a society can offer its youngest members, took a sensational, legally fraught newspaper stunt to force through a parliament that had been perfectly capable of debating the matter through ordinary legislative channels for years beforehand and had simply chosen not to prioritize it. Butler had already learned this lesson once from her own campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts. Quiet argument, however well-reasoned, however thoroughly documented, rarely moved the men who held power to actually change the law. It generally took public shock, sustained pressure, and no small amount of personal risk from the women willing to keep saying, loudly and repeatedly, what everyone in power would have preferred to leave unsaid. Return, for a moment, to the Contagious Diseases Acts themselves, and to a detail that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Even setting aside every question of morality and consent, the acts were, by the assessment of a growing number of the very doctors asked to enforce them, simply not very effective at achieving their stated medical goal. Rates of venereal disease among troops in the subjected districts did not fall as dramatically as the Act's supporters had promised, and some physicians who examined the data closely concluded that the examinations were doing considerably less to control disease than the government had claimed when the legislation was first proposed. This matters because it undercuts one of the last remaining defences the Act's supporters could still reach for once the moral argument had been thoroughly lost. It was not only cruel, it did not even reliably work on its own stated terms. A system that subjected thousands of women to invasive, non-consensual medical procedures and extended periods of confinement built on the promise of protecting soldiers' health could not, in the end, even deliver reliably on that narrow promise. The entire apparatus rested on an assumption that controlling women's bodies would control disease that turned out to be as scientifically shaky as it was morally indefensible. Part of the medical problem lay in something the examinations could never address, no matter how frequently they were repeated. A woman examined and found clear of disease on a Tuesday could contract it that same evening and would not show detectable symptoms until her next scheduled inspection weeks later, during which time she might unknowingly pass the infection on regardless of how thoroughly she had been inspected only days before. The fortnightly examination schedule the later Acts imposed gave a comforting illusion of continuous medical oversight without actually providing it, a gap that a number of physicians of the period pointed out with increasing frequency as the debate over repeal intensified. A system built around the appearance of control rather than control itself is a phrase that could describe a great deal of what this story has covered so far, and the medical statistics only reinforced what the moral arguments had already suggested. The repeal campaign also gained an unexpected boost from a change in Parliament itself. The general election of 1880 returned a number of members more sympathetic to reform than the Parliament that had first passed the Acts 16 years earlier, and Butler's allies inside the House of Commons, though still a minority, grew steadily more organised and more willing to force votes on the question. Persistent pressure of exactly this kind, applied year after year by a coalition that never controlled a majority outright but never stopped asking the question either, is often how difficult legislation eventually falls. It rarely falls in one dramatic vote. It falls after enough votes have been forced, enough ministers have grown tired of defending the indefensible in public, and enough of the original defenders have either changed their minds or left office altogether. The formal end came in stages, as these things so often do. In 1883, following years of mounting pressure from the Ladies' National Association and its allies, Parliament suspended the compulsory examinations, though the underlying acts remained technically on the books. It took 3 more years of continued campaigning, continued testimony, and continued public argument before Parliament finally voted in 1886 to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts outright. 17 years had passed since Butler and Wolstenholme first founded their association. 17 years of public speeches delivered at real personal risk, of a newspaper kept running against constant hostility, of alliances built slowly and carefully across class lines that Victorian society generally preferred to keep firmly separate. 17 years, too, in which thousands of women, most of them poor, most of them young, most of them entirely unaware that a campaign existed on their behalf until well after their own ordeal was over, passed through examination rooms and lock hospitals under a law that a determined minority of English women had already decided, from the very first year of its existence, was wrong. The final debates in Parliament, in the spring of 1886, carried a very different tone from the quiet, barely noticed passage of the original Act 22 years earlier. Where the 1864 debate had passed with minimal public attention, the 1886 repeal was watched closely, reported widely, and understood by nearly everyone involved as the culmination of a long and genuinely consequential public argument. Members who had once dismissed the repeal campaign as a distraction pressed by overwrought women now found themselves debating the matter as a serious, mainstream political question, a transformation in itself achieved entirely through the patient accumulation of petitions, speeches, testimony, and simple refusal to let the subject drop. The repeal did not undo what had already happened to those women. It could not restore the weeks and months lost to confinement, the wages missed, the reputations that had already settled, rightly or wrongly, into the fixed shape of neighbourhood gossip. What it did do, and this matters enormously even if it cannot fully repair the harm that came before it, was close the machinery down. After 1886, no woman in England could be legally stopped on a street in any town and forced into a medical examination on nothing more than a constable's private suspicion. The 11 o'clock rule, in its formal legal sense, was over. It is worth pausing briefly to consider what became of the language the Acts left behind, even after the machinery itself had been dismantled. The word suspected, which had done so much damage across 2 decades of enforcement, did not vanish from English police practice simply because one specific statute naming it had been struck down. The older Vagrancy Act, with its own looser language about riotous and indecent behaviour in a public street, remained fully in force and continued to give police considerable latitude to stop and question women well into the 20th century. Repeal closed one particular door. It left several older, quieter doors standing exactly where they had always stood. Its informal sense, the older, quieter habit of watching, judging, and questioning any woman found alone after dark, proved considerably harder to repeal. That habit had never lived only in the text of a statute. It lived in gaslight and shadow, in the tone of a constable's voice, in the particular quickening of a woman's footsteps as she passed a darkened doorway, and laws, however carefully written, have never been especially good at reaching all the way into places like that. Return now to the woman you left walking home earlier tonight, parcel under one arm, boots aching, the last omnibus long gone. She has no name in this telling because most women like her left none behind in any record we can now consult, and it would be a kind of dishonesty to invent one for her simply to make the story feel tidier than it was. She stands instead for thousands of women whose names we do not have, and whose ordinary evenings, walking home from ordinary work, carried a weight we can only now, from this distance, begin to properly measure. She works, let us say, as a seamstress in a small workshop that takes in piecework from several of the better dressmakers in town. Her hours are not fixed by any clock she controls. They are fixed by orders, by deadlines, by the preferences of women wealthier than herself who want a gown finished by Thursday regardless of how many candles it takes to finish it. Tonight the order ran late, as it often does in the weeks before the social season properly begins, and by the time she has swept her workbench, banked the small stove, and pulled her shawl tight against the evening chill, the church clock nearby has already struck 11. She knows the route home without needing to think about it. Down the lane past the baker's, dark now, its ovens cooled for the night. Across the wider street where the gas lamps stand closer together, because this is a street the town council considers worth lighting properly, then into the narrower lanes near her own lodging, where the lamps grow sparser and the shadows between them grow correspondingly longer. She does not live in one of the 11 towns where the Contagious Diseases Acts formally apply. She has, in fact, never heard of the Acts at all, not by name, not in any detail a modern historian would recognize, and yet she walks a little faster past the darkened doorways all the same. She keeps her eyes down when a group of men passes, laughing loudly, smelling of the public house. She has learned, the way most women of her class and era learned, without ever being formally taught, that the safest woman on a night street is the woman nobody notices at all. This is the part of the story that a law, even a repealed one, cannot fully undo. The Contagious Diseases Acts touched a comparatively small number of towns directly, but the assumption underneath them that a woman's presence on a public street after dark required some form of justification, some proof of respectability she could produce on demand, had already sunk far deeper into English life than any single statute could reach. It lived in the seamstress's quickened footsteps just as surely as it lived in the examination rooms of Portsmouth and Plymouth, even though she herself would likely have struggled to explain, if asked, exactly where the feeling had come from. She has developed over the years a whole private grammar of small precautions, none of them taught to her formally, all of them absorbed the way children absorb the shape of a family's unspoken rules, simply by watching what happened to women who broke them. She never walks with her eyes on the ground for long, because a lowered gaze reads, to a certain kind of man, as an invitation rather than a wish to be left alone, and she learned this the harder way once, early in her working life, and has not forgotten it since. She crosses to the lit side of the street automatically now, without needing to decide to. She has, more than once, ducked briefly into the doorway of a closed shop simply to let a group of loud men pass ahead of her, waiting in the shadow until their voices fade, then continuing on as though nothing at all had happened, because to her nothing had. This was simply Tuesday. This was simply the walk home. Consider, too, what she carries home with her besides the finished parcel of piecework. A small tin of matches, in case a lamp along her route has gone out early. A hat pin, worn less for fashion than for the quiet reassurance of having something sharp within reach. A habit shared by a great many women of her generation who never spoke of it openly, but understood one another perfectly on the subject. A route memorized so thoroughly that she could, if pressed, walk it with her eyes closed, because familiarity is its own small form of protection, and an unfamiliar street after dark carries a fear that a familiar one, however imperfectly, does not. Along the way tonight, she passes a public house spilling light and noise out onto the pavement and crosses to the far side of the street well before she reaches it, a small adjustment so automatic she barely notices herself making it. She passes, too, a young constable standing at the corner where the wider street meets her own, narrower lane, and feels the familiar small tightening in her chest that any uniform produces in her now, regardless of whether this particular officer has ever shown her anything but ordinary courtesy. It is not this constable she fears exactly. It is the category he belongs to, and what she has heard second-hand about what men in that category are sometimes permitted to do to women in hers. She reaches her lodging house a little before 11:30. The landlady, a widow who rents out 3 upper rooms to working women in similar circumstances, has left a single lamp burning low in the front hall, as she does most nights, and locks the door promptly at midnight regardless of who has or has not yet returned. This, too, is its own small rule, unwritten and unlegislated, governing exactly how late a respectable woman might reasonably be expected to be out, and exactly what judgment awaited her if she tested that boundary too often. Upstairs, in a small room she shares with another seamstress from the same workshop, she unpins her hat, sets down her parcel, and allows herself finally to stop walking quite so carefully. The tension she has been carrying since the church clock struck 11, tension held so habitually she barely registers it as tension at all, begins, slowly, to loosen. This is a small, private, entirely unremarkable moment. It happened, in some form, to thousands of women across England every single night for decades. It never made the newspapers. It never troubled a single member of Parliament. And it was, in its quiet way, exactly the kind of moment the Ladies' National Association had spent 17 years fighting to protect. Her roommate is already asleep, or close to it, a single candle burned down almost to its holder on the small shared table between their 2 narrow beds. Tomorrow will bring another order, another long day bent over the same close needlework, another walk home, whose hour will depend entirely on how quickly the stitching goes. There is no dramatic resolution waiting for her at the end of this particular evening, no clear moral or tidy lesson she could put into words if asked. There is only the ordinary, hard-won relief of a door that locked behind her, a bed that is hers for the night, and a morning that will arrive, as mornings do, regardless of what the night before demanded of her. Multiply her now by every other window in the building, and every other lodging house on the street, and every other street in the town, and every other town in England where women walked home this same way, carrying this same quiet vigilance, on this same kind of ordinary night. It is a strange thing to try to hold in mind all at once, thousands upon thousands of separate private walks home, each one entirely unremarkable on its own, each one shaped in some small way by exactly the fear this story has spent so long tracing back to its source. History rarely lets us see a pattern this large made up of moments this small. Tonight, for a little while, you have been allowed to see it anyway. There is a particular kind of history that lives not in the grand speeches or the parliamentary votes, though this story has included both of those, but in moments exactly like this one. A woman reaching her own door safely, a key turning in a lock, a body allowed, finally, after a long day and a longer walk, to simply rest. The Contagious Diseases Acts, and the ordinary daily fear that spread out from them well beyond their formal legal reach, made moments like this one feel less certain than they should ever have had to feel, for women who had done nothing at all to deserve the doubt. It is worth remembering as this story begins its own slow walk toward its close, that the woman on the corner tonight, whoever she truly was, whatever her name might have been, almost certainly never knew the name Josephine Butler either. Very few of the women most affected by the acts, and by the culture of suspicion that grew up around them, ever met the campaigners fighting on their behalf, or read a single issue of The Shield, or attended one of Butler's public meetings. The two worlds, the world of the woman walking home and the world of the woman organizing in drawing rooms and lecture halls to change the law that shadowed her path, rarely touched directly, and yet they were, in every way that mattered, fighting the exact same battle from opposite ends of the same dark street. Josephine Butler lived another 20 years after the repeal of 1886, and she did not spend them resting. She turned her attention abroad, traveling through France, Italy, and Switzerland to campaign against similar systems of state-regulated prostitution in other countries, carrying the same arguments that had eventually prevailed in England into rooms full of strangers who did not yet share her government's hard-won conclusions. She continued writing. She continued supporting causes she believed mattered, including greater access to higher education for women, and reform of the property laws that still, even after all her efforts, left married women with only a fraction of the legal standing granted automatically to their husbands. She and George moved to Winchester in 1882, where he took up a position at the cathedral, and the two of them settled into a quieter chapter of life together, though quiet, for Josephine Butler, remained a relative term. George died in 1890, and Josephine, by her own account, felt the loss deeply, having spent nearly 40 years married to a man who had supported her public work at real cost to his own career, without once asking her to soften it or set it aside, or make herself smaller to protect his comfort. She continued her own work for another 16 years after his death, her health gradually declining, her public appearances growing less frequent, though her convictions never did. She died on the 30th of December 1906 at Wooler in her native Northumberland, not far from where she had been born nearly 79 years earlier. She did not live to see British women granted the vote. That milestone arrived 12 years after her death in 1918, and even then it came only partially, extended to women over the age of 30 who met certain property qualifications, a far narrower grant than the one already enjoyed by every adult man in the country. Full and equal suffrage for British women, on the same terms as men, would not arrive for another decade beyond that, in 1928, more than 2 decades after Butler herself had already been laid to rest. Elizabeth Wolstenholme, who had co-founded the Ladies' National Association alongside Butler back in 1869, went on to a long career of her own in the wider women's movement, campaigning for married women's property rights and for suffrage long after the Contagious Diseases Acts had been struck down. The two women's paths, so tightly joined at the very beginning of this story, spread outward afterward into the many separate campaigns that together made up what history now calls, in broad and somewhat flattening strokes, first-wave feminism. Neither woman used that term herself. It had not been invented yet. They would likely have described what they did simply as trying to get a specific, terrible law removed from the books, one petition and one hostile public meeting at a time. It is tempting, in telling a story like this one, to reach for a tidier ending than history actually offers. It would be a comfort to say that Josephine Butler saw every injustice she fought against fully undone within her own lifetime, that the vote followed swiftly on the heels of the repeal, that the 11 o'clock rule and everything it represented simply dissolved the moment Parliament struck the Contagious Diseases Acts from the statute books. None of that is quite true, and the women this story has tried to honour tonight deserve the truer, harder version instead. It is worth remembering, too, that Butler's fight was never entirely finished, in the sense that no single generation's fight against an injustice this deeply rooted ever entirely finishes. Regulated systems resembling the one the Contagious Diseases Acts had established persisted for decades in other countries, and Butler herself spent a considerable portion of her later years travelling to argue against them abroad, meeting resistance in France and elsewhere every bit as stubborn as the resistance she had first encountered at home. The particular English law was dead by 1886. The underlying set of assumptions that had produced it about whose bodies the state was entitled to police and whose it was not proved considerably more durable and continued reasserting themselves in new forms and under new names in country after country for long after Butler herself had stopped being able to fight them personally. What is true and what deserves to be remembered clearly is this. Josephine Butler was born into a country where a woman could be stopped on a public street, accused on nothing more than a constable's private suspicion, and subjected to a forced medical examination that a growing number of doctors, clergymen, and ordinary citizens of her own era were willing to describe plainly as a form of assault carried out with the full authority of the state. She spent 17 years of her adult life at real and repeated personal cost, making sure that arrangement could not continue, and by the time of her death, it could not. The law she fought no longer existed. The machinery of arrest and examination she had described so carefully, so unflinchingly, in speeches most respectable women of her class would never have agreed to deliver, had been dismantled town by town until nothing of it remained on the books at all. She had been born into a country where walking on the wrong street at the wrong hour of the night could make a woman a criminal in the eyes of the law. She died in a different one, not a finished one, not a fully equal one, and not one where every shadow on every dark street had suddenly become safe, but a different one all the same, changed in ways that mattered enormously to the women who came after her, most of whom would never know her name, in exactly the way the seamstress walking home in an earlier part of this story never knew it either. That, perhaps, is the quietest and truest lesson sitting inside this whole long story. Change of this kind rarely arrives as a single dramatic victory, announced all at once and felt immediately by everyone it touches. It arrives instead the way most real change arrives, slowly, unevenly, town by town and law by law, carried forward by women whose names mostly go unrecorded and by a small handful of women whose names, through sheer persistence and considerable personal cost, managed to survive. Both kinds of women were necessary. Neither could have finished the work alone. Consider, one final time, everyone this story has asked you to hold in mind together. The unnamed seamstress walking home a little too quickly past a darkened doorway, who never heard of Josephine Butler and never needed to because the law that once threatened her had already been dismantled by the time she was born, or perhaps only shortly before. The women who did pass through the lock hospitals, whose names survive, if they survive at all, only as entries in an admissions ledger, a date, an age, an occupation, nothing more. Rebecca Jarrett, whose own difficult past made a crucial piece of reform possible, and who paid for that contribution more heavily than the men who orchestrated it around her. Elizabeth Wolstenholme, who co-founded the whole campaign and then carried her convictions forward into decades of further work most people today have never heard her name attached to. James Stansfeld, who spent years of a promising political career defending an unpopular cause in a chamber full of men who would have preferred he simply stopped, and Josephine Butler herself at the center of it all, respectable enough to be heard, stubborn enough to keep speaking long after speaking had become genuinely dangerous to her own safety and standing. The gas lamps of Victorian England are long gone now, replaced by brighter, steadier light that reaches further into the shadows than any lamplighter with his 8-foot pole could ever have managed. The Contagious Diseases Acts are gone too, struck from the law almost a century and a half ago, remembered now mainly in university archives and in stories exactly like the one you have been listening to tonight. But the woman on the corner, quickening her steps past a darkened doorway, keeping to the lit patches of pavement out of a habit she could not quite name, would recognize something in almost any city street, in almost any country, even now. Some rules outlive the laws that first gave them shape. Some habits linger long after the fear that taught them has faded from memory. None of this is offered as a reason for despair, tonight or any other night. It is offered instead as a kind of quiet inheritance, passed down from women who could not have imagined you listening to their story a century and a half later in a world reshaped by exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous work they gave so much of their own lives to. They did not know your name either. They fought for you anyway, in the same way they fought for the seamstress and the laundress and every other woman whose name never made it into any surviving record at all. That is perhaps the most generous kind of history there is. The kind fought for people its participants will never meet, on behalf of freedoms those people might one day take for granted, without ever knowing exactly what it cost to secure them. Let that thought settle now, gently, without needing to be answered tonight. Let the room around you go soft and dim and unimportant, the way it was always meant to by this hour. There is nothing left to solve here, and nothing more that needs deciding. Only a long walk home, finally finished, and a door somewhere far off in the past, closing quietly and safely behind a woman whose name we will never know, but whose ordinary evening all these years later has finally been given the attention it always deserved. Picture the street one last time, not the version filled with fear, not the version watched over by suspicious eyes and plainclothes officers and magistrates half asleep on their benches, just the street itself, quiet now, the gas lamps burning low and steady in their small gold circles, one after another, all the way down the lane and out of sight. The seamstress is home. Her door is locked. Somewhere above her, a single candle gutters out, and the room settles into darkness the way a held breath finally settles into rest. Josephine Butler's house in Winchester is dark too in this telling, its work long finished, its papers filed away in archives that very few people will ever think to open. The Shield stopped printing long ago, the lock hospitals closed their doors one by one and were repurposed or forgotten or quietly torn down. The 11 o'clock rule, the formal one, the one written into statute, has been gone now for longer than most of the women it once threatened ever got to live. You do not need to carry any of this forward with you into sleep. You have listened well tonight, and that is its own small, quiet act of remembering, and it is enough. Let the details go now, one at a time, the way a town lets its lamps go dark at the end of a long night. The garrison towns, the examination rooms, the 17 years of speeches and hostile crowds and a newspaper kept running against the odds. Let all of it settle gently into the past where it belongs. Let the names go too, gently, in their turn. Portsmouth, Plymouth, Winchester, Liverpool, the small Northumberland village where a woman named Josephine was born, and the small Northumberland village not far from it where she finally came to rest. You do not need to hold on to any of these place names specifically. You only need to let the feeling of the story settle somewhere quiet inside you, the way a good, true story always does, whether or not you remember every detail of it by morning. What remains, if anything remains at all as your eyes grow heavy, is only the smallest image. A woman reaching her own door. A key turning easily in a lock that opens for her and no one else, and asks her for nothing in return. A room, warm and dim and entirely hers, for as long as she needs it. Hold that image softly for as long as you can. Then let it go too and rest. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. And if tonight your eyes gave out before your ears did, remember that our full library of stories like this one is also waiting for you on Spotify, ready whenever you need it, with the link sitting in the description and in the pinned comment. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is right now as you drift off. I am always curious about that, and if there is a piece of hidden history you would like told this same way, gently and in full, leave it in the comments. Sleep well.